Welcome back to another episode of Haunted and Historic Australia's Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. Today we have another ghostly tale for you. The Lady in Black. Now, to understand the environment or the geography of whereabouts the Lady in Black is, we should go back to the beginning of how it was that Victoria Pass was first established. Now, the Blue Mountains were first wandered through by Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson. Governor Lachlan Macquarie had given them permission for the expedition to go through or make their way through the Blue Mountains, because I guess that ever since they'd gotten into Sydney, they would have been able to see them from a distance. And at some point, they had to go and investigate these Blue Mountains. Now, Macquarie had given them the permission to do this venture. And on May 18th, 1813, they departed from Emu Plains, which is pretty established by this stage. They departed from the Emu Plains with a James Burns. He was a local guide and familiar with the surroundings, as well as the first people who lived in this area and the pathways that they already had established. He also took along 4 convict servants to assist them and probably doing all the dirty work. The expedition took about 3 weeks, as previously explorers had tried to go between the mountains. These guys, using the First Peoples paths, traversed the mountain ridges, and this took them through the mountains and onto the other side. So 3 weeks it took them, and Lachlan Macquarie was so pleased he gave them land, which is the whole reason they wanted to do it in the first place, was to get more land, especially Blaxland. And they were renowned then as the guys who made it through the mountains the first. And also as a result, they've got all the suburbs going up the Blue Mountains named after them: Wentworth, Blaxland and Lawson. So there you have it. That was the story of them getting through the mountains. Shortly after they'd made it through the mountains, a man by the name of William Cox was sent to basically organise a road. So the road was then established the years following, and Lachlan Macquarie then officially was able to visit Bathurst because they'd bore their way through. Now, as a result of this, the town of Bathurst was established. The town of Bathurst, being named after the 3rd Earl of Bathurst, or Henry Bathurst, the Secretary of State for War in the Colonies. Now, after it was named Bathurst and Lachlan Macquarie raised the British flag there in 1815, this meant that the first people, the Wiradjuri people, were now being displaced and murdered. This, among other areas, goes down in our history as a terrible time. Through this, though, Bathurst became a bustling town. This is where Our Lady in Black, or Carolyn James, was raised with her siblings. Carolyn was born in 1827 in Liverpool to parents William James and Mary Hopkins. Mary Hopkins was born in Parramatta, but William James was a convict from England. They were living in the Bathurst region, as it was also the first area in which people found gold. Flecks of gold were discovered in 1823, and this soon had people from all areas coming to Bathurst to try and find gold. Although Carolyn was born in Liverpool along with some of her siblings, her younger siblings were born in the Bathurst area. They may have moved up toward Bathurst in the hope of cheap land or perhaps finding gold. Now, in a gold rushy kind of town, not everybody wins. And if they did win, or they found some money, often these families would use that money for alcohol. And it's sad because a lot of these people had a lot of kids. So it wasn't the type of area or environment kids should be brought up in. I mean, having a couple of drinks on a Friday night with some friends around and you've got the kids in the house, that's a different story. But for these people back then, alcohol was probably the only thing they did at night. It is understood that the father William owned a grog shop, and it may not have been paying much. They were obviously drinking a lot of the stock. And as a result, life for this family went pear-shaped. In 1835, when Carolyn was only 8 years old, we find that her mother hangs herself, and the father is immediately accused of having part in this murder. The father was released as it wasn't the mother's first time at attempting to hang herself. They were an unhappily married couple and possibly living in poverty situation. A newborn child died shortly after the mother hung herself. The 5 remaining siblings must have all been sent to orphanages, except for the oldest brother, who was 14 at the time, John James, but it is not understood what happened at this point to John, and the girls ended up at a female orphanage. It is believed that this female orphanage was in Parramatta. As we know from our female factory episode, a lot of the girls from the female orphanage would be transferred to the female factory when they got to a certain age. This also meant that they were part of the matchmaking service that the female factory provided, whereas convict men and settlers who had done their time or had their ticket of leave could come and arrange a marriage with one of the ladies there, propose marriage, and the girls would be in the custody of their new husbands. And of course, the youngest women would have been picked first, hence why we find that in 1840 and 1841, Carolyn and her sister Maria are both married. And Carolyn married a William Collits at St Lawrence's Church in Sydney City in 1840. Carolyn was only 13 years old. Now, William Collits was son to Collits family who own an inn near Hartley. The father doesn't believe that William has sustenance, and it is believed also that William's not very strong a man. And 18 months after the two have been married, we find that Carolyn is actually moving in with Maria and John Walsh, her husband, in his 30s, and he was from Ireland, so he'd come out as a convict and had since done his time, his 7 years, and he was a bit of a thug. He was accused of murder a couple of times, including a murder of a mother and a son in a cabin, and one of the first people had accused him because he'd had him help him try and get the clothing and other items out of the cabin after the murder. It isn't believed that the girls knew about this, as I'm sure Maria would never have married him had she known that he'd murdered a mother and son. But to understand these girls, you have to look at how they were brought up. It wasn't a happy home, and at the female factory they would have found it even worse. So they probably went for whoever came along or possibly looked strong enough to look after them. They were only young girls, as we know, and probably looking for protection. But they wouldn't have found it in John Walsh, unfortunately. John and Mary get married in 41, so this would have been around the time Carolyn was looking to leave her husband. As we know, they were separated, not divorced, but separated, and she seeks refuge with her sister Maria and husband. It is believed that Carolyn is leaving William because she doesn't believe he is strong of mind, but she had no idea what she was about to get herself into. As we're starting to build this character around John Walsh, we find that he's quite a thug and he's not a very nice person. It could even be that perhaps Carolyn moved in to protect her younger sister Maria from John. It's not really written anywhere that they were having problems, but just from what I've read about John and how he gets quite intoxicated and drunk, it may not have been a really good atmosphere that Carolyn wanted to leave her little sister in. And other stories suggest that they were having a menage a trois, or that they were in relations, the three of them. So it's quite a strange story. But it all comes to a head when William and Carolyn try to reconcile their marriage. For whatever reason, Carolyn is thinking of going back to William. They agree to meet up at an inn close to Hartley, owned by Joseph Jaggers. And John Walsh comes along with Carolyn for support, or so we think, and Maria must be at home. Now, when they arrive, they meet up at the inn. From sources in the inn, it is known that John Walsh is already quite drunk. John orders brandy for himself and William, but William doesn't drink it. Carolyn has a lemon syrup and John drinks 2 glasses of brandy in total. They weren't there long, only about 5 minutes, but when they leave, John hits William and knocks him down. It is witnessed outside the inn. William gets up, and it is believed Carolyn tries to restrain John from hitting him further. And the last words that Carolyn has ever heard saying is, "Run, William, he has a stone and he will kill you." From what witnesses say, William runs off, as you know, we know he's not a fighter, obviously, and he's not all that together. But Carolyn manages to restrain John and they walk off. It is the last time Carolyn is seen alive. It was the morning of the 3rd of January, 1842, and William Collits is on the road heading back into town. On the way, he comes across a man who tells him he must go and get the constable right away. There's been a woman murdered on the road up ahead. He ran toward where the corpse was, and there were 2 convict men from a local stockade guarding her. He looked down. He knew it was Carolyn right away. Her bonnet and clothes from the night before, and she'd been bludgeoned to death with a stone, just as she said John had and was going to hurt William with. There was also a man's pair of braces near to the woman's body. She'd been dragged into the bushes and then dragged back to the road. There was also a number of buttons found near to the road. William rushed to get the police and bring them back to the scene. He was there for about 4 hours, and he gave them a good account of what happened the previous night, as well as accusing John Walsh. John Walsh was apprehended at his home in Blackheath, where the housemate, Mr. Gardner, who he'd been living with, was questioned. Mr. Gardner advised that John Walsh had come home all scratched up to the face, only wearing a shirt, and that he'd asked Mr. Gardner for a pair of braces, as he did not have any of his own at the time. This seeming very incriminating to Walsh, he stood up and declared that he'd been beaten as they'd left the inn. This would account for why he didn't have pants, the scratches on his face, and why Carolyn had been taken from him. He straight out accused the innkeeper's son, Joseph Jaggers Jr. For all accounts, everyone said that Joseph was in all night. It was the other son, William, who had been out. John Walsh had made the accusation about Joseph Jr., hence making his statement false. From here, there was a frenzy of trials. Anyone and everyone was questioned over that night. Everyone who was there, every witness, and anybody else that the two had come into contact with over the past time. But it did appear that John, having scratches on his face, and all witnesses saying that the innkeeper's son hadn't been out, all evidence pointed toward John, Carolyn's own sister's husband, John Walsh. We will never know what happened just a mile up the road from Jaggers Inn. There were no witnesses to the murder itself. It was just a silly, senseless murder. The trial went on for some months, and it isn't till May that the judge hands down a death sentence to Walsh. He may have gotten out of 2 previous murder charges, but he wasn't getting out of this one, and he is hung a couple of days later. What a tragic story, and confusing and strange in so many aspects. Why did she leave William? Why was she going to get back with William? What happened to her younger sister Maria? And why would John kill her? So many unanswered questions, raising more questions than answers. Because she was planning to go back to William? Maybe he didn't want to lose 2 women. There have been other stories that suggest that William's mother had been paying the girls to keep control of William for years, that possibly William took Carolyn as his wife from the female factory, and they took Maria with them, and the family brought up the 2 girls for the next year while Carolyn was married, but then they left. And there's a story around some cattle that was apparently promised to Maria. John Walsh was angered at William because the cattle wasn't being given. So there's a lot of weird stories and background about it. I mean, considering that Pierce Collits, William's father, didn't want to have anything to do with his son. It's just a really weird set of circumstances. But unfortunately, it's all resulted in the death of Carolyn, a young girl who only a couple of months later would have been 15. It's tragic. But the story doesn't end here. So this brings us to the Lady in Black. Now, the steepest section of the road that was built by convicts under the instruction of William Cox wound up and over Mount York, but the danger of accident was so great that an alternative route was surveyed by Major Thomas Livingston Mitchell, and convicts got to work again in 1930, so as it wasn't as dangerous, but still dangerous. It was still a mountain. But he had 400 convicts working on Victoria Pass. Finally finished in 1832, but many convicts lost their lives in its construction. Now this is 10 years before Carolyn James is murdered, just around that area. These days, coming down the mountain through the Great Western Highway, people give little thought to the perils, physical and otherwise, that lurked at Victoria Pass. We feel safe in our cars now, and barriers along the sides of the road that wouldn't have been there back in the day, back when most of these stories were told. These days there's little time to look out the window while you're driving, let alone notice a woman in black standing beside the road. Back in the early days, it was quite a challenge to climb the top of the descent to the other side without accident. And if travelling at night, there was the added risk of encountering the Lady in Black, or otherwise known as the Ghost of Victoria Pass, that haunted the second bridge on the eastern side. Since Carolyn died in 1842, there has been many accounts of a ghostly apparition appearing on the second bridge. Travellers became terrified. Horses wouldn't move. There was a tale of two young men reported that as they approached the bridge, their horse became so skittish that one of them had to climb off the cart and lead the animal. They assumed it was a night bird or another animal that had spooked the horse, but as they drew closer to the bridge, they saw that the horse had already seen or sensed a tall, slim figure, a female dressed in black. The figure was standing beside the stone parapet of the bridge, looking down into the gully below. They assumed it was a living person, and one of them called out, "You're out late, miss. Are you all right?" At first the figure seemed not to hear them. Then it slowly turned toward them, keeping its head tilted down and its features in the shadows. When the figure moved, the horse stopped in its tracks, and no amount of encouragement or pulling would make it step onto that bridge. One of the men sitting in the cart called out, "Would you mind stepping off the bridge for a moment, missus? It's our horse. You see, she's scared." The youth never finished his sentence. The words froze in his mouth as the ghost of Carolyn James raised her head to show her face and stared directly at the group. "I never seen nothing so bloody frightening before or since," one of the youths later said. "As soon as we saw her face, we knew she weren't human. Her eyes shone like a tiger's. There were sparks of fire in 'em and shooting out of 'em. She raised one arm high in the air, the other, her hair streamed out in a breeze like seaweed in shallows. Then the worst part happened. The thing's mouth opened and a soft moan noise came from inside the black hole. It got louder and louder until it seemed like it was all around us and inside us, and it changed from a moan to a terrible howl. You know they talk in the Bible about demons howling. Well, I reckon that's what that were, a demon howling. It sounded like no human or animal I ever heard." That terrifying sound was too much for the horse. All of a sudden, the horse bolted. The man holding the reins had to hold on for dear life, and the fella that was leading the horse had to wait till the tailboard came past and clambered aboard. The horse pulled the cart at such speed that they didn't know whether they went through the ghost, around it, or under it. They had no idea what had just happened. Once they were several hundred metres down the road, the driver managed to bring the horse under control. Both men looked at each other, and one of them said, "What in the hell was that?" The other replied, "I don't know, but I hope I never see it again, and it ain't following us, is it?" Closing his eyes tightly, he mustered the courage to turn and look. He opened them. "It's still there, on the bridge." The other man, fearful, yelled, "Go, mate, just go," his voice quaking. The fellow with the reins slapped them against the horse, and they took off. They didn't stop until they reached their hometown, Blackheath, 5 kilometres further down the range. This was just one of many stories over the last almost 200 years. Tales of the Black Lady stepping out towards vehicles, right up until they've upgraded the road and widened it so many times that the old bridges are barely visible. Henry Lawson, the Australian poet, came to live in a nearby village of Mount Victoria in the early 1880s when he worked with his father as a builder, and he wrote a 16-verse poem about the ghost of the second bridge, written around 1891. Henry Lawson's poem, The Ghost of the Second Bridge. You'd call a man a senseless fool, a blockhead or an arse, who'd dare to say he saw the ghost of Mount Victoria Pass. But I believe the ghost is there, for if my eyes are right, I saw it once upon a near-to-be-forgotten night. 'Twas in the year of 89, the day was nearly gone. The stars were shining and the moon is mentioned further on. I'd tramped as far as Hartley Vale, though tired at the start, but coming back I got a lift in Johnny Jones's cart. 'Twas winter on the mountains then, the air was rather chill, and so we stopped beside the inn that stands below the hill. A fire was burning in the bar, and Johnny thought a glass would give the tired horse a spill and help us up the pass. Then Jimmy Bent came riding up, a tidy chap was Jim. He shouted twice, and so of course we had to shout for him. And when at last we said good night, he bet a vulgar quid that we would see the ghost in black, and sure enough we did. And as we climbed the stony pinch below the Camel Bridge, we talked about the girl in black who haunts the second bridge. We reached the fence that guards the cliff and passed the corner post, and Johnny, like a senseless fool, kept harping on the ghost. She'll cross the moonlit road in haste and vanish down the track. Her long black hair hangs to her waist, and she is dressed in black. Her face is white and dull dead white, her eyes are open wide. She never looks to left or right, or turns to either side. I didn't believe in ghosts at all, though I was rather young, but still I wished with all my heart that Jack would hold his tongue. The time and place, as you will say, 'twas 12 o'clock almost, were both hysterically favourable for a ghost. But have you seen the second bridge beneath the Camel's Back? It fills a gap that broke the ridge when convicts made the track, and o'er the right old Hartley Vale in homely beauty lies, and o'er the left the mighty walls of Mount Victoria rise. And there's a spot above the bridge, just where the track is steep, from which poor convict Govert rode to christen Govert's Leap. And there is a teamster killed his wife, for those old days were rough, and here a dozen others had been murdered right enough. The lonely moon was over all, and she was shining well, and angels from the sandstone wall the shifting moonbeams fell. In short, the shifting moonbeams beamed, the air was still as death, save when the listening silence seemed to speak beneath its breath. The tangled bushes were not stirred, because there was no wind, but now and then I thought I heard a startling noise behind. Then Johnny Jones began to quake, his face was like the dead. "Don't look behind, for heaven's sake, the ghost is there," he said. He stared ahead, his eyes were fixed, he whipped the horse like mad. "You fool," I cried, "you're only mixed, a drop too much you've had." "I'll never see a ghost, I swear, but I will find the cause." I turned to see if it was there, and sure enough it was. Appeared to plead for aid, as far as I could see. Its hands were on the tailboard laid, its eyes were fixed on me. The face, it cannot be denied, was white, a dull dead white. The great black eyes were open wide, and glistened in the light. I stared at Jack, he stared ahead, and madly plied the lash. To show I wasn't scared, I said, "Why, Jack, we've made a mash." I tried to laugh, 'twas vain to try. The try was very lame, and though I wouldn't show it, I was frightened all the same. "She's mashed," said Jack, "I do not doubt, but 'tis a lonely place, and then you see it might turn out a breach of promise case." He flogged the horse until it jibbed, and stood as one resigned, and then he struck the road and ran, and left the cart behind. Now Jack and I since infancy had shared our joys and cares, and so I was resolved that we should share each other's scares. We raced each other all the night, and never slept that night, and when we told the tale next day, they said we were intoxicated. Now, whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's such a spooky tale. I know Mitch and I are definitely going to go up to Victoria Pass sooner rather than later to check this out for ourselves in an upcoming adventure. Because I believe, even though the roads have been widened and the bridge is barely visible, I believe Carolyn is still there. They say she may have cursed Mount Victoria, but the people of Mount Victoria don't believe this to be true. The more probable is that Carolyn from the grave is just trying to work out what happened herself. And perhaps she is trying to flag people down. Maybe she doesn't realise she's passed on. Whatever the case, it's definitely worth checking out. If you, like us, enjoy a little bit of spookiness, we're definitely going to check it out for ourselves. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for many more ghost stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more spooky videos.